Episode 6 of Andor's second season just had a very controversial moment. You've probably heard the news. A fan favorite actor and character was recast for the show. We'll talk all that and more, as well as a history of Star Wars recasting on today's video. Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome. Hope everyone's having a great day, and I hope everyone enjoyed the 3 most recent episodes of Andor. Let's get right into it. Andor just featured Bail Organa. However, for the first time, the character, the adopted father, of course, of Princess Leia, was not portrayed by Jimmy Smits, but rather Benjamin Bratt. Now, there had been some whispers of this happening before the season aired, and I'll break down why in short details before we go into sort of the history and what I think. So, Tony Gilroy gave an interview and he explained quite simply that Jimmy Smits just wasn't available. He's filming something else. However, the character of Bail is clearly important to the rebellion at this point. This is me saying this, not him. And I honestly think it would be a disservice if he wasn't featured in what will be the most important work, arguably, of the era, at least until the original trilogy. I know what you're thinking, well, really? Him just showing up at a party is that important? No. I actually doubt this scene would have featured in the show at all had Jimmy been available. Rather, this was Tony and the crew ripping the band-aid off so we were aware of the recasting before what will be more scenes featuring Benjamin throughout the rest of season 2. Bail Organa is going to return. There is no question about that. So we needed to be prepped so his recasting wasn't just jarring in the middle of a more important scene. So that's it. That's the simple explanation for why the recast happened, and I totally agree with this. I agree in this specific example, and I agree philosophically with the idea of recasts, as we'll get to in a moment. Before that, however, I thought it could be fun to look at a history of recasts in Star Wars, and it goes back to the very first Star Wars movie. And I know what you're thinking. Who was changed between episode 4 and episode 5? That's not what I said. I said the very first movie. In A New Hope, Star Wars, Wedge Antilles is portrayed by 3 different people. So, for the first part of the movie, Wedge was played by an actor known as Colin Higgins. He's the guy sitting next to Luke during the Death Star briefing. This is meant to be Wedge. Does it look like Wedge, the Wedge that we all know and love? Not really, but it was meant to be Wedge. People call this guy Fake Wedge. Later, he was replaced by real Wedge, Dennis Lawson. However, there's even more to it, as both new and old Wedge are dubbed over by David Ankrum. And so many characters, by the way, in A New Hope are dubbed. Once you see it, you won't be able to ignore it. So much dubbing, so much ADR. But yes, of course, Dennis Lawson would remain the face of Wedge for the rest of the franchise. Other recasts were due to necessity, usually the story jumping around in terms of time. Obviously, with the prequels, many characters got new, younger renditions, and to put it mildly, George Lucas did not seem to be overly concerned with whether the appearance of the character in the prequels matched their original trilogy counterpart. Sometimes it worked out, but Ewan McGregor looks way too young to be the Obi-Wan we knew and loved 18 years earlier. And that's the same with Uncle Owen, Aunt Beru, and others. George Lucas famously was not overly concerned about continuity when it got in the way of filmmaking, and he would change a character, an actor, their voice, whatever, if he thought it better served the story. Maybe the most famous example of this is, of course, Palpatine. In The Empire Strikes Back, Palpatine was portrayed by a woman named Marjorie Eaton, famously with chimpanzee eyes superimposed on her face. I bet a lot of you, especially my younger viewers, never watched Star Wars in their original form, so you're probably not familiar with this scene. The voice came courtesy of Clive Revill, who sadly died, by the way, just over a month and a half ago. His version of the Emperor is very different, far more sophisticated than the eventual Palpatine we'd get, which adds its own menace in a way. I'm not gonna lie, I also thought the original Palpatine was beyond creepy, but of course Ian McDiarmid got the role for episode 6 and ever since, and he's done a fantastic job. So a recast in favor of the story. Now, admittedly, those situations are different than what we saw with Jimmy, and in fact, we saw George Lucas do the opposite, at least sort of. I'm sure many of you remember Captain Panaka from The Phantom Menace. Well, they couldn't get the actor to return for episode 2, so George Lucas instead created the character of Gregor Typho. In universe, the two are actually family. I believe it's like an uncle-nephew thing or cousins. But because they operate as the same character and they look similar enough, very casual fans may not notice. Well, for those fans who do care, there is an explanation if you want to dig deep into the lore. All right, so moving back to the present day, I do want to talk about why I think recasts generally are a good thing, or at least why they're necessary for a franchise like Star Wars. Star Wars now is 2 years away from being half a century old. It is quite clearly, and I mean this in all seriousness, one of the greatest modern stories, and I think it has and should embraced its role as a new form of myth. There are several things that come alongside that. We've got characters who have been active in some form or another beyond the lifespan of their original actors. Sometimes you can work around that. Obviously, when Peter Mayhew sadly passed away, he was the body actor for Chewbacca, but not the voice. People could step in and continue his legacy without it affecting as clearly what's on screen. But when Ray Stevenson passed away, I don't think there was much doubt that the story should continue. You know, everyone who's a part of Star Wars really is just this smaller part of a great myth, a myth that continues on. And I don't think Star Wars really is trying to fool anyone. They are stories, and given Star Wars' role as a myth, I think it's important that they're meant to be stories. As viewers, I think we should accept that what we're seeing on screen is really just an expression of the overall story. I remember back when Pablo Hidalgo had Twitter, he would talk about how we should see Star Wars' use of real-world idioms. You know, sayings or expressions which only make sense if you live in our world, making their way to Star Wars. And that could be everything from referencing the Earth, or how words like chimera make their way into ship names. And the way he explained it is, you can imagine that there's a story, a true story, underlying all of it. I don't mean true as in it actually happened, but there's a pure story, and what we see in the films or in the TV shows is basically that story translated to us, the audience. Yeah, maybe basic wouldn't actually be English or whatever in a galaxy far, far away. It maybe isn't if you're watching it somewhere else or in your own native language, but that's the way it's portrayed for us. And really, I've always held the same with actors. I love Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, you know, as with many of you, I'm sure, he was a hero of mine growing up, but Star Wars as a myth has meant that Luke Skywalker has reached beyond the character of Mark Hamill. And the more I think about it, well, I really did love The Mandalorian Season 2. I actually think that tying the character so explicitly to Mark Hamill does a bit of a disservice to what Luke is and what it means. I would have preferred for Sebastian Stan or the actor they had for Luke in The Mandalorian before he was deep-faked to take over the role. I'm not saying this should be done flippantly or as much as possible, but Solo, for example, I had no problem contextualizing it as a story of Han, Lando, and Chewbacca, even though we've seen young Han and he didn't look like Han in that movie. I'm happy Andor still gets to tell its story, even if I'm reminded that, hey, this isn't real. This is a myth we're seeing played out on screen. In some ways, again, I think it's a benefit to Star Wars. It certainly is a benefit that Tony Gilroy will be able to tell his story as he intended. We've already lost, sadly, so many actors and actresses from the original trilogy. As time goes on, obviously, we'll lose even more. I don't want to lose those characters as well. So yeah, let's make it work. Let's bring older actors in, like Tamura, even if they don't perfectly match the age of their characters. Let's do what George Lucas did with Palpatine, what Tony Gilroy did with Andor, and what Star Wars has been doing from the very beginning. Those are just my thoughts, though. Let me know yours, of course, down below.